Hello everyone, this is Piero and Giorgio. Today we are December 6th. I wanted to say December 7th, a day that will live in infamy because we have again Jack Langness with us. Or is it Julian?
Julian or Jack. I go by Jack in real life, but my legal name's Julian, and that's what I write under.
Okay, because indeed that's what I see as the book I read of yours. And today you have some news. You are coming out with another book.
Yes, absolutely. I'm just finishing it up. It should be coming out in January, February. It's called Identity Rising, How Nationalist Millennials Will Retake Europe, Save America, and Become the New Greatest Generation.
Excellent. So this is following of your previous book, which we talked last time in the video, which was about fistfights in Europe. The exact title, remind us the exact title.
Yeah, Fistfights with Muslims in Europe, One Man's Journey Through Modernity.
Exactly, which we commented, and I also commented in another video as being very good. And that was more than a year ago. So tell us a little bit, how does this new book follows? It seems to be quite a program that you're explaining there.
Definitely. I'd say it's pretty similar in scope or theme to the speech I gave at Ameren last summer, and it's basically about the millennial generation and how millennials kind of fit in the path of the previous generations, the baby boomers, Generation X, etc., and whether the millennial generation is going to end up being remembered as a bunch of social justice warriors with blue hair and nose rings, or something a little bit more noble and impressive, and how that all ties into what you and I probably both think is going to be happening in the next 10 to 20 years as far as increased strife or anarchy on both sides of the Atlantic.
So interesting that some people think that this will all start in America and that America will fare better than Europe. And other people think that Europe is going to lead and actually fare better than America. What makes you be in this latter thought?
Well, yeah, the category I'm in is the idea that Europe will fare worse. I think it's interesting. I think it'll be different. America, I think, will be defined by the fact that we're so extremely heterogeneous at this point. There's so many different groups. Everyone is so spread out and dispersed. So there's not really a binary setup where there's A versus B. There's A through Z, and we're all spread out, and it's a little more anarchic and dispersed, I guess you could say. So I think that if or when there's a great big economic recession or collapse or anything on that span, I think that in America things would go sort of more the direction of Brazil or South Africa, where there's increased crime, lowered societal trust, increased anarchy, that sort of thing. Whereas in Europe, I think it's set up more. I think the economic situation in Europe is worse. I think that in a collapse, Europe would fare worse in that regard. And then the demographic situation is also worse. But I also think it's defined by the fact that in Europe, you do have more of a binary situation where there's the native Europeans, and then on the other side, the vast majority of the immigrant population are all Sunni Muslims. So it's much more an A versus B type of situation. You could also say an A versus B versus C, in that there's the Muslims, Sunni Muslims, who are all quite unified. And then on the other side, there's the Europeans in the Angela Merkel, Emmanuel Macron model, who are actively enthralled to this religious ideology of ethno-suicide. And then there's the others, such as yourself and I, and most of the people listening to this, I imagine, who do want Europe to be preserved and to survive.
For sure. So so what led you to that conclusion in terms of, in writing the book? What were the key elements, the triggers that led you to think of those scenarios?
Well, I'd say I first started thinking about all this, especially in Europe, when I first traveled there as a teenager and an early 20-something, like I wrote about in my first book. And as a kid, I had traveled to Europe quite a bit with my parents, but had never really been exposed to what was going on there. It was always more in a touristy way. And I had a very idealized vision of Europe and pictured it as all kind of Sound of Music, Astrid Lindgren, beautiful, perfect utopia. And then when I first traveled there, you quickly realize that no, that world might have existed or sort of existed at some point, but in the decades since the baby boomer generation and progressivism took control of European politics, that reality and all those things had been moving closer and closer to destruction through massive Muslim immigration. And then as far as the new book that's coming out, one of the big catalysts for it was the Strauss-Howe books on the generations that you might have read. They've been writing about this subject for, I think, like 30 years, since the mid-'80s, about their generations theory and how the generations are sort of cyclical. And they actually first wrote a book about predicting that the Millennial Generation would be the new great generation, and they wrote that in the mid-'90s. And last year, I was listening to an interview that Neil Howe, the main author, did with Brett McKay, the editor of artofmanliness.com. And they were talking about his theory and predicting the coming fourth turning, that there'd be widespread strife. And he was predicting that millennials would take a lead role in confronting that and become a quote-unquote great generation. But it was clear that he was limited. He was unwilling to really name anything that could really add to that strife or cause it. They were both sort of grasping at straws, saying, well, maybe the economy will go downhill a little. And I think that it's very clear to anyone looking at the situation soberly that there's very clear catalysts for what could become really horrific strife or anarchy in Europe and in America. And those are unpopular things to name because they're politically incorrect. But I think that there's something that any sober-minded observer is very cognizant of.
Now, of course, when you say Europe, you mean Western and Nordic Europe, because obviously Eastern Europe is preserved so far from this problem.
Absolutely. That's an extremely good point. Yeah, I definitely mean Western Europe. It seems like the worst countries in this regard are France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Sweden, Norway to some extent, the UK definitely. And I think those are the ones that would see the most widespread strife. Economically, I think too, obviously Italy, Greece, Spain are all in positions where I think it'd be difficult for them to weather a big economic downturn. But on the cultural and demographic side, I think that those countries I just named are all the ones most ill-prepared. And then obviously that's been one of the most hopeful things we've seen, I think, since the last time you and I spoke, is the extent to which the Visegrad countries under Orban and the other leaders have really said, hell no, we are not committing suicide, we are not going the way of Western Europe. So I think that's been one thing that's given me a lot of optimism.
In fact, from what I hear, obviously I've not read your book yet, is that in fact you seem to be, like I am, quite optimistic on the long run.
Yeah, I think that human nature always tends towards survival, and I think that what we see, this phenomenon right now of mass immigration or ethno-suicidalism with Macron and Merkel and May and Le Pen and all these other leaders, I think it's a historical aberration. I think that's one of the things I write about in the new book, that I think it arose out of this completely unprecedented prosperity that the West has seen since the 1950s onward. That's really a historical anomaly. And because the baby boomer generation was born into such immense comfort and safety and economic prosperity, it sort of allowed them to dive into a lot of this weird ideology they have, or this sort of religion of progressivism, which most of our ancestors never would have had time for because they were busy surviving and having to actually deal with reality. And now reality is returning to the West, and that's why I think it's catalyzing in the younger generation a return to more saner politics. Now,
what's your approximation of in that younger generation of the percentage, let's say the split of people who seem to be still progressive and obviously going into the public school, having propaganda from the state, compared to the people who start to wake up because every day they get beaten, they get harassed, and have problems daily?
That's a really good question. I don't know what the exact numbers are. I think there's more and more people in that 15 to 35-year-old age bracket who are becoming, whatever you want to call it, red pill. They're becoming more aware of these things, seeing past the progressive indoctrination they were raised within. I think, if I'm remembering right, there's a blogger named Audacious Epigony who's done some really good posts all about these different statistics and how the different demographics and age groups voted in the last American election. I'm trying to recall some of the numbers from that. I believe that among European American Occidental millennial voters, I think it was like 55 or 60% of female ones voted for Trump and maybe 75% of male ones. So that could give you some idea of it. Certainly the blue-haired, nose-ring-wearing social justice warrior millennials get a lot of media attention, and a lot of people associate them with the millennial generation, unfortunately. In Europe, I'm trying to remember, I feel like in France, among native French millennials, I feel like a majority or close to it voted for the Front National, which is hopeful. So maybe anywhere from 30 to 70% are starting to wake up from it, hopefully 50 to 70.
Okay, well, that's hopeful.
That might be a little optimistic in some countries, like Sweden, perhaps.
Now, hold that number in thought, and let me give you a statistic that came out 2 weeks ago. In 2016, the births in France that are not European in origin are 34% for the whole country, and 73% in Paris. So basically, the window of opportunity before half of the fighting age men are non-European is 10 to 15 years maximum. So do you think that's the time frame in which things will happen, or will it be later, or will it be sooner? What's your timing for that?
Well, yeah, you just put your finger on it, Piero. I think that's the key question, because you're right. I think that certainly in countries like France and Sweden and the UK, if things don't improve if there's not a shift in the next 10 to 15 years, it absolutely will be too late. And I think in some of the countries it's even bleaker than that. I know Black Pigeon Speaks did a really good YouTube video last year on German demographics, where he did some really really intense calculations, really spent some time on it, and said that in Germany, the 18 to 35-year-old demographic will be majority non-European by 2020 at the latest. It
Yes.
might already be majority non-European. I tried to do the same thing in a more mathematically limited guesswork type of way with Sweden, based on some different stats I got from, I think, Spiza.com and a couple others, and I estimated it was about the same in Sweden. I think that in a couple of those countries like Germany and Sweden, the demographics are even worse in the 18 to 30-year-old demographic than in the 0 to 15, because they had so many teenage and early 20-something migrant men come in the last few years during the migrant crisis. I know in Sweden, another kind of horrible statistic is that I forgot the age ranges, but within the younger generation, there's 125 males for every 100 females, which is worse than what we saw in China in the 1980s during the one-child policy days, where that was a big kind of infamous thing, the gender imbalance. But yeah, I think that hopefully things start to improve in the next 10 to 15 years before it's too late. And I do think that economically we're well positioned to have that kind of economic catalyst, because I do think that the economic problems that we've been kicking down the road for the last few years are going to show their face within the next few years. I think that with all the baby boomers suddenly retiring, taking all of them out of the workforce, they're all going to stop spending as much money. They're all going to start having to take out, rely on their pensions, their retirement accounts. That's going to be a negative factor economically. We have interest rates at literal 3,000-year lows. There's a huge pension crisis in the U.S. There's increasing gap between the rich and poor. So I do think we're well positioned to see a big economic downturn. I'm relatively bullish on the American economy long term. I think it's almost like, it's kind of like Brazil, where things might get worse socially and culturally, or in terms of crime, but that the economy might just keep chugging along anyway, despite that, just because the demographics aren't so bad in America. But in Europe, I really do strongly think that there's going to be a big economic downturn in the next 10 years in countries like Germany and Sweden, France.
Okay, interesting. Let me be the devil's advocate on one point. Some thinkers in the right because there's no other place where there are thinkers, of course. But some of the thinkers in the right say Islam is not the problem. The problem is globalization. It's the globalists who want this mixing of people so that they can better control us. And now that people are waking up to this control and this basically world global dictatorship, they are pushing us to fight with Muslims so that we forget whose fault it is. And so they think we should not fight Muslims, we should ally with them to fight the globalists. What do you think of that train of thought?
I think they're right in part. I don't have any problem with Muslims per se whatsoever. You know, I can sit next to a Muslim on a plane or have a Muslim cab driver and happily talk to them for hours. I will admit my take on everything, it's a little different than maybe I guess you would call like counter-jihadi perspective, where it's really focused on how bad Islam is. I mean, I do think there's a lot of points in that regard. I think that Europe being overrun with, you know, mass Muslim immigration does pose a lot of problems that wouldn't be the case if it was mass Hindu immigration or Eskimo immigration, right? I do think there are specifics about Islam sort of as a legal system in addition to a religion and some other things that do pose unique problems. So they're right that in a sense the problem isn't the Muslims, because the Muslims are acting very rationally from their perspective, right? I mean, they're just doing what their religion tells them. I mean, they're practicing the hijrah, conquest by migration, and they're, you know, kind of just slowly taking over Europe by having lots of children and everything else. I mean, they're acting rationally from an evolutionary perspective, right? The problem is the globalists who, or what I would say, the part of it's a problem of sort of these, you know, globalist corporatists to some extent, but I think the major brunt of the problem is basically this religion of progressivism and, you know, Western suicidalism, as I call it. It's this kind of religion that came from a lot of, you know, I guess you could say it has a lot of roots going back to, you know, certain class of professors in the 1960s with a certain kind of shared history, all the way back to, you know, Freud. I mean, you know, there's a large number of roots it kind of stems from. But I think that, like I said, since the 1960s in the West, it's really been manifested mostly by this grouping of baby boomers, the Angela Merkel generation, you know, Nancy Pelosi in the U.S., all these different people who sort of embraced these very utopic ideals of multiculturalism and kind of white guilt and all this different stuff, and basically have completely overhauled everything to do with Western civilization within that time frame. I mean, I think it's basically just a nihilistic religion of societal suicide, right? That's why I think one thing we hear a lot is people say, oh, well, I don't understand why the progressives want Muslim immigration, because they believe in gay rights and feminism, and Muslims oppose those things, so it's contradictory. It just doesn't make sense. But I think if you realize that essentially the highest goal is just the overturning of all established mores and traditions, it does make sense, because yes, while Islam and gay rights and feminism, these things might seem contradictory, they're both an overturning of the established system, and therefore they're complementary. So just like economic Marxism was about the proletariat and those who were, you know, historically economically oppressed, taking power over their historical economic oppressors, cultural Marxism, which is the ruling orthodoxy of the West today, is about the socially oppressed taking power over their social oppressors. So as white men, we're at the top of that pyramid of inherent evil, of what the West needs to be cleansed of. So the progressives speak very openly about wanting to turn America and all of Europe into countries where white people are a minority, where ethnic Europeans are a minority, where toxic masculinity doesn't exist anymore. And I think in a lot of ways it's very similar to turn the other cheek Christianity, where it's a real romanticization of victimhood. It's victim politics. but turned into this, sick religious extreme where they're willing to basically allow their children to be raped by Muslims, to allow their fellow members of their group to be murdered by terrorists, to allow their countries to die in the name of this, you can only call it a religion.
In history, tribes who do that usually disappear very, very fast. Now, in your opinion, what's the solutions? What should we do? Should we do politics? Should we trust the politicians, the governments? What are the means that we have to gain back our sovereignty?
Well, great question. I guess it depends on who we're talking about as we, right? So if you, Piero, or me, Julian, was suddenly made king of Sweden, I think that it would be very simple, right?
There would be blood.
We would try in a humane way. We would immediately cease all immigration into Sweden or the UK or whatever country we're talking about. We would try to humanely reverse the devastation that's been wrought. We would, give carrots or impetuses to all the migrants to basically migrate back to the Middle East or wherever they want to go to in a humane way. I mean, I certainly wouldn't advocate going and killing all of them or something like that. I mean, it would be humane, and you would slowly turn around all the horrible things that have been done, and then you would ideally, in my opinion, have a country like Sweden remain a Swedish homeland, right? I mean, it would be just like Japan for the Japanese, or, Malaysia for the Malaysians. It would be no different than that. So that would be the right solution if people like you and me were in power and could affect such a solution like that. But if you view it like those you mentioned a minute ago, where you kind of view it as countries like Sweden and France being ruled by a sort of foreign occupying force that doesn't share the best interests of the regular Swedes or French, and you're looking at it, Piero and Julian as writers, journalists, activists, what all the people like us can best do. I think it's a range of things, everywhere from metapolitics, writing online, creating content online, trying to awaken people to just what's going on, educate them past the sort of social programming they've received through progressivism in the schools and the universities, to other forms of leverage such as building wealth, donating to others that are fighting metapolitically, having children, even something as simple as that, just building our social capital and leverage. To trying to, even though I don't have a lot of hope for traditional politics in Sweden or France or the UK, I don't think it's wrong to try to fight within that arena. I still think it's the right thing to do. And then all the way on the other side to, I guess, what you could call preparation, so to speak, as far as being prepared to take advantage of any kind of strife or anarchy that arises in some kind of collapse that we might see in the next 10 to 15 years in Europe or the US.
Okay. Now, in the political scenario, if you add the immigrants who get the voting rights very quickly in many countries, if you add them to the progressives and the aging baby boomers who certainly don't want any change, because as long as they're alive, they want everything to stay the way it is, the percentage in the ballot is hardly going to be to our liking. It seems to be increasingly, and I think the window of opportunity in America was indeed last year's presidential election and perhaps next year's midterms. But if things continue on that trend, the demographics and the statistics show that eventually the immigrants who vote for whoever gives them more money and allows more people in, which is the progressives, well, the latter will be in power until we all are a tiny minority, and eventually we end up living like the whites live in South Africa, or worse. So, you really think politics has a chance?
No, I don't. I agree completely. I think there's absolutely no political solution in a country like Sweden or the UK or France. I think that those same baby boomer progressives I was speaking about, basically, engaged in massive importation of immigrants, primarily Muslim immigrants, not just because it was a part of their religion of sort of ethnic or cultural suicide, but also because it was a very convenient way to ensure that they would stay in power politically. When you can import a class of voters who will vote for your party, it sort of makes democracy meaningless. And I think that that's what we've seen, certainly in those countries in Europe and even in the United States to some extent. Although Republicans certainly share the blame for mass immigration in the U.S. too. They're not. They're just as culpable as the progressives, but for other reasons. But yeah, I absolutely think that in a country like Sweden, France, etc., Belgium, that there's no more political solutions. So I think it really comes down to the individual, whether it's me or you or, John Doe who wants Western Europe to survive, to just sort of asking yourself, how best can I contribute? What is my unique skill set? How can I best kind of fight against what's going on? And depending on the individual, it could be trying to work through traditional political means, I guess, as a part of the meta-political war, or it could just be writing, journalism, activism. It could be other things, forming organizations. I read an article about a gentleman, I think he was a self-made wealthy entrepreneur in France, and he had created an entire camp in Poland where he brought other Frenchmen to get basically combat training so that they would be prepared for as things deteriorate in France over the coming years. All the way to, I think in some cases, there's probably people who could contribute best by going to a country like the Czech Republic or Hungary, where there's a more friendlier political climate, and using that as a base with which to advocate for the interests of the native Swede or native French people. I mean, I think that as things continue to get worse in Western Europe, we'll begin to see an even more black and white distinction between the Visegrad countries and Russia on the one side that are opposed to Western Europe suicide, and the Merkels and Macrons and Le Pens and their sort of cosmopolitan friends on the other side who are, still actively engaged in destroying Western Europe.
What are you doing yourself for that preparation? What's your, as an individual, what do you do?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess for myself, I think the best way I can contribute is sort of a mix of those things. I think mostly metapolitically, writing, about to start 2 different YouTube channels, everything in content creation based, awaken people to what's going on. I think that in some respects, I think I can best do that well by sort of working within the open window, or sort of shifting it right, because I'm a pretty normal average guy in general. I own a couple of small businesses. I think most normal people can relate to me, and just trying to make it clear that not wanting Sweden to be totally destroyed, not wanting Western Europe to be destroyed is a pretty normal, commonsensical thing to think. It's not extreme at all. And then at the same time, the other stuff I mentioned, like building wealth, having children, trying to affect leverage in that regard, and then also just preparing in any way possible as well.
Okay. So the eventually, when you talk about your blogs and your channels, who do you try to address yourself to? And can you give us your the channel name so that people can check them?
Well, I haven't created them yet. So right now I'm just finishing up my next book, and if people want to get info on that and read the writing I put out, they can go on EuropeanCivilWar.com. That's the website I've been running for about a year and a half, and where I publish most of my content. And then within the next few months, that book will come out. I'd certainly encourage them to get on the email list on my website, and they'll get a couple advanced chapters from it and know right when it comes out. And then they'll also get any info as soon as those YouTube channels start, so they can access as well. Okay.
So before we meet on the battlefields somewhere in Europe or North America, any conferences that you're going to give in America or in Europe, or you're going to be part of in the next future?
I hope so. Yeah, I in the last year I got to do a number of them. I spoke at a couple Northwest forums, and I spoke at the American Renaissance Conference, and all of that was a tremendous privilege and honor, and a huge amount of fun. I enjoyed the heck out of that. It was some of the coolest things I've ever been a part of. Actually, it was really incredible. So I certainly hope to be at more Northwest forums and be at AMRA next year in one capacity or another.
Okay. So I will put the links of your blog and channels on the video description below. And is that vodka or water?
Perfect. Yeah, EuropeanCivilWar.com. And then if they go on Amazon, they can look up my name, Julian Langness, Langness, and they'll get access to the first book I wrote, Fistfights with Muslims in Europe, and also a book of essays I just put out called The Coming War in Europe, the previously published essays from Countercurrents, Traditional Right, Western Spring, and my own site.
Excellent. We'll talk again, and perhaps in the new year when your book is out. And in the meantime, I encourage people to read your first book and to continue checking and getting informed. And next call, we'll probably do more nitty-gritty and tactical advice for people. I have lots of ideas how we could do stuff together.
Wonderful. Perfect. I appreciate it, Piero.
Take care.